Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy. You're reading with Jimmy. We're going to be analyzing and understanding Guy de Maupassant's An Old Man, which I hope you read with me. It was a wonderful short story. I almost didn't analyze this story. It's so short and so entertaining. Well, really, what's to analyze? An 86-year-old man reads about an ad in a health spa that could prolong his life. So he goes there. He has the doctor database, everyone over 80. And then he starts to meet with the doctor and reviews when someone from the list of 17 people die. What they died of, and the story ends with a twist on old age. Really, really a great read. But then I got an email from one of my readers that included a post that someone wrote on Maupassant stories. So I decided to continue with this analysis of An Old Man. And I fold in this email simply because this writer of the email confused my reader. And so my reader asked me for advice. And I'm here to tell you that the guy who wrote this email, not to me, but the guy he found online, got it all wrong. I don't know how many of Maupassant's stories the writer of the email to my reader found and read, but he seems to have read many on his own, but unfortunately he didn't read with Jimmy. Here's what the email said, okay? So let me first just say that I am quite past the stage of my life where I am in any way think my opinion is an accurate judgment of the actual worth of a piece of art. That being said, I can't change what I like and what I don't like, and after reading a collection of short stories by Guy de Maupassant, I have to say I didn't really like them. The biggest problem I had with the stories, and most of them, were so damn depressing. I'm not usually one to shy away from dark tones in literature. I actually prefer them, but so many of these stories just end on complete downers, even the ones I like. The bad guys go unpunished, the good guys get screwed, etc. It just got old. I get that that's a realistic way of telling stories, and it'd be equally as boring if they all ended happily, but a bit of justice now and then would have been nice. And the depressing endings weren't really my main issue. It's the endings that were usually completely uninteresting. So many times the stories would end in such an obvious way. It's like Maupassant didn't even try to think of an interesting ending. Some of the stories didn't even... I'm laughing because this guy is he's way off. Some of the stories didn't even seem to have an ending at all. They just petered out. I don't want some twist ending every time, but come on, give me something. Maybe my expectations were set too high up, though I don't think that's justified, as all I've heard about Maupassant is that he's not one of, if not the best short story writers of all time. And these stories left me completely unimpressed. I don't know. I know there was a lot of symbolism that I did not pick up on. I could have, but I wasn't reading analytically. I rarely do when reading on my own for pleasure. So maybe reading from that perspective would have helped. I could also have been the translator. I've looked everywhere and I can't find who it is. Can't find who it is in my rather cheap edition. Even a bad translation won't change the plot. Oh, well, maybe I'll have better luck with O. Henry. So this guy is totally ridiculous. Do you understand? No wonder he confused my reader, because this guy is just off the wall. And I'm going to take this apart slowly but surely to show you why he's off the wall. Because I'm certainly glad this reader took the time to write it, and I welcome all comments from my own readers, including what they find on the internet, which is where my reader found this note. So before analyzing An Old Man, I want to reply to this reader on the internet and offer my reply as a discussion starting point. And of course, you or anyone else can email me back with your own comments, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, with your own comments, conclusions, because I enjoy hearing from you. So let's start this way. Remember what I tell you. The first sentence, paragraph, page is the most important part of anything you read, including classics. This regards email, essays, news stories. First part is always important, but it also headlines. If you read headlines in the Wall Street Journal, you can tell when bias starts to creep in. You can tell when you could just tell. But it also includes anything you read. So the reader's opening is a tell. He says, let me first just say that I'm quite past. Those are my brackets. He meant past the stage. So he can't even write. Part of the problem with this guy who's criticizing Maupassant and doesn't know the name of the book of his translator that he's reading is that he's really just he's not thorough. He's past the stage of life where I in any way think my opinion is an accurate judgment of an actual worth of piece of art. So he really says he doesn't know crap. So why is he writing this? Why am I wasting my time analyzing what he wrote if he's just stupid? Well, it helps us understand narration, right? So the reader has no accurate judgment, then why offer an opinion? It actually is a disqualification of his judgment. All right? Doesn't he disqualify? He says, I don't know what good art is, so why comment on what he admits one of the all-time greatest writers? Remember where he said that? Okay. Not being able to change your own opinion is also a tell. That being said, I can't change what I like and what I don't like. Well, in a sense, that's true, but in a sense, pardon me, if you're going to read classical literature like Hamlet or Maupassant, you can't dumb that down. You got to come up. You got to leave what your comfort zone is. And after reading a collection of short stories, I have to say I didn't like them. Well, personally, I don't care what you like. In fact, if you're reading with Jimmy and you don't like what I'm reading, what do? You just stop reading, right? You hit the off button. That's your choice. If you've only been reading with me for a while, you know the only thing you can count on is change, right? Change is everywhere. Marcus Aurelius talks about it. Admitting you cannot change is simply wrong, unless you can't really change. But everyone can change. We just read a while ago Notes from Underground, and that's a narrator that could not change, right? He changed, he vacillated. You have to read it with Jimmy. It's really what you like or don't like when it comes to classical literature. It's not really about what you like and don't like. Think about that. Think about what I'm saying. It's not about what you like and don't like, right? You have to move to the literature. The literature is not going to move to you. The literature is the literature. You have to bring yourself up to understand the literature. Because who cares what you or I or anyone else likes or doesn't like? Classical literature is supposed to teach us how to lead our lives in order to lead others, which, by the way, an old man does. We're going to talk about that. Expecting the literature to move to you or to like he's criticizing Maupassant on his endings and so on, or he should do this or he should do that. Well, then he should write a damn story himself. He should write a story himself. These classics have not stood the test of time because they have bad endings or because they're not written well. You understand what I'm saying? You can't dumb down Hamlet. You have to train yourself to rise to Hamlet. The same is true for Maupassant. The writer of that email admits maybe my expectations were set too high, though I don't think that's unjustified because I heard he's one of the best of all times. Well, just because his expectations were set high and he read it and it didn't meet his expectations, I would respectfully suggest that you don't really know what the hell you're talking about. Because if you had high expectations and he did not meet your expectations, you just didn't read them right. There are many short stories of Maupassant on my website, and I invite you to read them with me. I'll help you understand them. So he didn't really read these stories. He gives us additional clue to his state of mind. I don't know. I know there was a lot of symbolism I didn't pick up on. I was reading analytically, so maybe that would help. I've never understood the difference between reading analytically or for pleasure. Is reading pleasurable? Oh, yes, Jimmy. Oh, yes. No, it's not. It's hard work. You got to be thinking. And thinking is hard work. Jim Mattis said that in Call Sign Chaos. You got to think strategy until your head hurts. So in my mind, analysis is pleasure. And by the way, hard work is pleasure. It certainly would have helped this reader if he had read Jimmy more as I analyze classics, right? Readers who have been with me a while know this. Besides, just because he viewed the ends of stories he read as depressing, well, is that really true? We've read, like I said, several of Maupassant on here. Are they depressing? Well, Jimmy, I read Two Friends with You and they get shot at the end. Yeah, they do get shot, but it's just not about getting shot. It's about freedom, that story. Remember? So the stories end the way the writer wants them to end. And it's up to us to understand why they end as they end. Right? Many of them are not depressing. You remember the old man? We're going to read that, right? He asks the doctor, what did he die of? I don't know. And then he tells him, I don't know. And he says, well, how old was he? 89. Oh, well, it certainly wasn't old age. And it's a funny ending. I lost it when I read it with you, remember? So he talks about ending. The depressing endings weren't really the main issue. Endings were completely uninteresting. Well, classical literature is not, unfortunately, about you or what I want. It's not about what we want. It's about what the writer, through his narrator, wants and shows us. So you have to erase your blackboard when you read a classic. You can't come in believing this, believing that, like this character did. And then you get into the rhythm of the story. And I hope he comes back someday and reads with Jimmy. So that said, let's begin our analysis of An Old Man. Any questions? Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. You recall the Dr. Monsieur Durand was talking about the most recent death of the 17 people, Paul Timonet. Quote, a sort of mummy of whom it had been hoped to make a centenarian and an advertisement. So they were going to use him as an ad if he made it to 100. But when the doctor tells Durand he doesn't know what Timonet died of, Durand becomes incredulous. Well, what do you mean? You don't know? The doctor always knows. Hadn't he some organic lesion? They go back and forth until Durand tries to figure it out. And finally the doctor says, I've no idea. He died because he died. And then Durand, in a voice full of emotion, asks, exactly how old was that one? I can't remember. And the story ends with this, that the doctor answered him in response, 89. And the little old man at once incredulous and reassured, 89, so whatever it wasn't old age. ... If you don't laugh and smile at this ending, then you've missed the entire point of the story. And there's nothing depressing about this ending, which brings us to trying to understand what this story is about. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this story is about dying. It's about living. It's about death. And before we turn to our friend Aristotle, let me look and take a break in the story where the third-person narrator tells us about this guy, Durand. Remember this? This is the section. You see that little space here, between Monsieur Durand to the word eyes? This section here is insight into Monsieur Durand, right? He's very careful. He avoided wine. You remember this? He uses possessive. It's my doctor, my skin, my eyes, right? He's very careful. And this sets up the entire narrative because the narration is important. This is all third person. It's not Monsieur Durand saying it. It's not the doctor. It's nobody in the spa. It's someone, right, outside the story. It's important to understand the position of the narrator if you're going to understand any story. And then this one, it's the third person. It's not Maupassant. You understand? It cannot be the writer. Well, Jimmy, it can be, can it? Well, you could try to say that, but it's not. It's the third person narrator. Maupassant is just the writer. The first sentence from the third person narrator sets the scene. You remember that? It sets the scene of the story. This ad appeared. And this passage about Duran, from the third-person narrator, only a third-person narrator could know all of these details about Monsieur Duran. It gives us insight into the old man's character, and it gives the story meaning. We meet Duran shortly after the ad, and there the doctor and the stage is set for the story. Maupassant's stories have a habit of the third-person narrator sometimes doing an aside. An aside in a play is where the actor turns to the audience and talks directly to you instead of the other characters. It's also sometimes in a courtroom when the judge says, come on up here, and he talks to them in a little tete-a-tete. So you see these parentheses here? That's the narrator doing a little aside. He who Monsieur Duran was 2 years older than Rosalie, the first one who died, but he claimed to be only 70. So when he showed up at the spa, because he took care of himself, he was, looked younger than his age, he claimed to be 70, although we know he was 86. So why does someone lie about their age? That's a clue. The Maupassant third-person narrator has done this before, as we've seen in other stories, and these little comments actually enrich the narrative. That little comment there tells us about Monsieur Duran, right? He just doesn't want to die. He doesn't want to die. So plot and Aristotle. According to Aristotle, tragedy has 6 main elements. We know this by now. Plot, character, unless this is your first story with Jimmy. No, welcome if it is. I like Aristotle because he defines everything and we can look in that context. Plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, song, of which the first 2 are primary, plot and character. And while an old man isn't tragedy, right? Per se, it's not a tragedy. It still follows the rules of Aristotle. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Aristotle told us plot is a representation of human action, and there's human action in here, right? He's studying the 17 people who are over 80. Plots can be simple or complex. Aristotle tells us complex plots, say that 5 times, complex plots are required for successful stories. And there's a little footnote you can read. You can pause me and read these footnotes. They're very informative. An old man is a simple plot. It's not a complex plot. Nothing really, right? Well, it's not complicated. The character, Monsieur Duran, doesn't change. He's obsessed with death when it starts. He stays obsessed with death when it ends. Although he's got a little sense of humor when he says Paul did not die of old age. But beneath the humor, what he does is tracking 17 people. There's a presence of the main character in this story. All right. Death. Death is the main character in this story. Sometimes in a sentence you'll have an implied subject, right? Something's implied. Go home. If I say, go home, the implied subject is you go home, if I'm talking to you, right? Go home, the implied subject. You don't have to say you. So in this story, the main character in this story is death. He's afraid of it. The spa helps you live longer to avoid it, and so on. So the plot must be unified to display a beginning, middle, and an end. Well, it kind of does, even though it ends with the death of Paul and Monsieur Duran saying he didn't die of old age, but we all know the end of the story. Right? Do you know the end of the story? Monsieur Duran will die, which is part of the beauty of this story, because we're all going to die. And this guy who is so careful not to die is fighting a losing battle, right? Right? He's fighting a losing battle. Jimmy, are you saying that, damn the torpedoes, we should just live? Like, do whatever we want? No. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when you read this story and analyze it, you're reading about an old guy who doesn't want to die, who tries all he can do. He looks at other people as puppets. You remember when he said that? And he's using these 17 people to experiment with their diet. He's talking to the doctor. And the doctor, you'll remember one line in there, was amused. Remember that? When the narrator told us that the doctor was listening to Monsieur Durand amused. Anyway, the old man meets this definition, doesn't he, of a beginning, a middle, and an end? Because he moves to the spa, has conversation, people start dying, he reviews it, and then Paul dies, and it's not from old age. So, is 86 years old? Is 86 years old? Is that old nowadays? I want to return to the passage that is set off from the rest of the story for a moment, which explained his obsessive fear of death. He, Durand, deprived himself, we read this already before, all the pleasures of the world that were because they were dangerous. And whenever anyone expressed surprise that he shouldn't drink wine, and wine, the purveyor, see this dash here? That's the narrator again, sticking his comment, right? Wine, that purveyor of dreams and gaiety. He would reply, Durand, in a note of fear, which could be detected, I value my life. So he's afraid to drink wine. So the narrator continues to explain his obsession with fear. Do you know what obsession is? What is obsession? Are you obsessed with anything, anyone? It's an idea or thought that continually preoccupies or intrudes on a person's mind. I think we're all a little obsessed once in a while. But in Darren's case, it's dying. He's obsessed with death. Doesn't want to do it. Obsessive behavior refers to persistent and intrusive thoughts, images, or urges that cause significant distress and interfere with daily life. Did it interfere with his daily life? Of course it did. Everything he does is to avoid dying. So he should just live in a bubble, right? He stressed the word my as if that possessed some special distinction. Possessive pronouns, my arms, my hands, my legs. But where this distinction was really noticeable was when he referred to his doctor. This was my doctor. And people were puppets. And that's what he does with the people at the spa, doesn't he? Those 17 people. He reviews them. And did the doctor violate privacy? Don't forget, this was written many, many years ago, 1870, something like that. Did he violate privacy by giving Monsieur Durand the list of 17 people over 80, including their background, et cetera, et cetera? Perhaps, but privacy in those days, well, it wasn't the same thing as it is in these days. But that's not the point. If the point is, well, why did he violate people's privacy? No, he didn't really do that. He's given it to them because, first of all, did he know that Durand was 86 or did he believe he was 70? I don't know. What do you think? If he's enjoying Monsieur Durand, right, trying to avoid death with his conversations, what the heck, right? He gets a dinner out of it. So would you agree that he's obsessed with death? I think you would. So several movies came to my mind when I read this story, especially when we're going to finish talking about it. Meet Joe Black. That was in 1998. If you saw some of these movies, I hope you remember them. And if you didn't, I hope you see them. So Anthony Hopkins plays this guy, Bill Parrish, who's a business guy. He's going to celebrate his 65th birthday. But Brad Pitt, who plays Death, visits him on his 65th birthday and decides that he wants to find out, let's make a deal. I'll give you a few extra days and you'll spend the time getting to know what it's like to be human. And Joe, you'll let me figure it out what it's like to be human. Because remember, death is not human, right? So Joe falls in love with Bill's daughter, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to tell you the end. Can death fall in love? Is that possible? Well, in the movie it is, but death is death. They depict death in many, many ways. Let's continue. Death Takes a Holiday, which was the basis for Meet Joe Black. This is the original movie, Death Takes a Holiday, with Frederick March, who plays Death. And since he's unable to relate to humans, he decides to try it and become human. So he takes the form of Prince Serki, and he comes down, and women are instantly attracted to him. Why is that? But once they really get to know him, they become frightened. Well, of course they do. So he meets a woman, and Death finally learns what is love. And here again, they fall in love, or she falls in love. I'm not going to tell you the ending of that movie. The Seventh Seal. You may or may not have seen this one. This is Ingmar Bergman's one famous classic. It's when Max von Sydow, he played Christ in a movie too, a Swedish knight. He plays a Swedish knight coming back from the Crusades by the name of Antonius Block. And he comes back and he starts playing chess with Death, and they make a deal that Death will let him live as long as he keeps winning. So they start playing chess, and as long as Antonius keeps winning, he gets to be alive. Okay? He's tormented by, Block sets off on a journey. He meets travelers and his wife, and becoming determined to evade death as long as possible to be redeemed. I'm not going to tell you the ending of that story, but it's a cool story because you cannot escape death. That's the deal. Death will ultimately win. Here Comes Mr. Jordan is another great movie about death, where a boxer gets killed and he's prematurely killed. He's not up for death yet. So he gets to heaven, and they say he's not there. So the boss, the angel's boss, Mr. Jordan, who is probably God, who's played by the wonderful actor Claude Rains, he sends Joe back to find a body. He wants him to get a body. And I'm not going to tell you the rest of that story because he was prematurely killed. It was an accident. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, accidents happen. A Christmas Carol, finally, is one of my personal favorite by Charles Dickens, which the third ghost is death. And he comes and he shows Scrooge what his life will be after he dies. And you should know the ending of the story. And there are many, 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 many more movies about death. But an old man discusses death with a twist, the idea of being afraid of it or not. That's what this story is about. Remember, we read to see how others lead their lives and how we should lead ours, right? So Aaron is very afraid of death. The doctor takes care of people before they die. You go to a doctor because you want to stay healthy. You take physicals, or you don't. We know certain things can be bad for our health, but we do them anyway, right? So living or dying, that's a part of nature, right? We live, we're born, we live, we die. But to be afraid of death obsessively, like Monsieur Durand, there's a lesson here for all of us. And the lesson comes from Zorba the Greek, a very good book, not a classic necessarily, by Nikos Kazantzakis. This was a 1946 book about Alexa Zorba, who's learned about life through actual experience. And then there's an educator, a professor who shows up on the island, and Zorba tries to teach him about life. And the quote that I want to refer you to is, look, this is Zorba talking. One day I had gone to a little village, telling this to the professor. An old grandfather of 90 was busy planting an almond tree. "What, Granddad?" I exclaimed. "Planting an almond tree?" And I don't know if you know about almond trees, but they don't just grow overnight. He's 90. "You're planting an almond tree?" And he, bent as he was, turned around and he said, "My son, I carry on as if I should never die." Okay, so that's one point of view. That's the old man. I carry on like I should never die. That's why planting an almond tree, I'm never going to die. I'm going to live to see these almonds. And I replied, and I carry on as if I was going to die any minute. Right? So Zorba says, I carry on like I'm going to die any minute. That's the opposite philosophy. Which of us was right, boss? All right, you're all out there, you're all the boss. Which of those two philosophies is right? Are you going to live like you'll never die? Or are you going to live like you might die any minute? Which is the right way to live? What does Monsieur Durand, live? Is he living like he'll never die, or is he living like he'll die any minute? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Is he right? So the two different philosophies, he probably represents the first one. He's going to live like he'll never die. But there is no second point of view in this story that you will die any minute, right? If you're going to live like you're going to die any minute, you're going to do anything you want, anytime you want, right? You're not going to be careful. Or will you be careful? Did I flip that? If I carry on like I'm going to die any minute, am I being careful or being careless? If I live like I'm going to never die, wow, that's probably it. So this might be wrong. Jimmy might be wrong. It's not the first point of view, it's the second point of view, right? The second point of view. Wow. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I know I'm going to get emails that it's the first point of view, but that's okay, because that's what discussion is, isn't it? Probably the central theme is fear. Fear. I think we all can agree that Monsieur Durand is very afraid of what? Of death. On Jimmy's website, you'll find meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and I encourage you to read them. This Roman emperor was a Stoic, and when he killed barbarians during the day, he wrote in his journal at night, and fortunately the journal survived. One of his thoughts on death, and he had many, goes like this, quote, "It is not death that a man should fear, but rather he should fear never beginning to live." Aha! Never beginning to live. Right? So I fear like I will never die. I want to live, right? Live every minute. You understand? Jimmy would say that sums up the lesson of an old man, that a classic by Guy de Maupassant, and I certainly hope you enjoyed it. That illustration shows the main character hovering over their little dinners. You've been reading with Jimmy, and this was the analysis of an old man. You can email me, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, and be sure to enjoy all the classics read by Jimmy on my website. This is Jimmy. Thanks for sharing your time with me. Have a great day, and remember, live like you'll never die, or live like you'll die any minute. Geez, what should we do?